Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shekalim Daf Gimel contains 3 Mishnayos, and I go for the last one. From the beginning of the Daf until the first Mishnah finishes the commentary on the Mishnah that began the Masechta. It describes what are the tzorchei rabbim, the needs of the public that are taken care of on the 15th of the month of Adar. It has contradictions from 2 other Mishnayos out there, or it's 2 issues which are contradicted by one Mishnah. It then discusses in detail the work of marking graves so that people wouldn't step on a tumah, gives sources for it, and describes exactly some halachos involved with the proper marking. Okay, so first of all, our Mishnah had said that on the 15th of Adar we do a number of things, including tzorchei rabbim, needs of the public. So the Gemara here explains what these are. The Gemara explains that there are a lot of things that are involved with punishments or repercussions to people for their actions, and we want to clear these things out before the end of the year. We want the new year to start with a clean slate, and therefore we take care of a lot of these things that people owe or punishments that people deserve. We're going to clear these up. Anything which is left over, these things can be handled all year, but if it hasn't been taken care of yet, we're going to do it now. What are some examples? So the Gemara says the courts convene and they discuss halachos of monetary disputes. They discuss trials where somebody's on trial for something which carries the death penalty or malchus. These trials are completed before the end of the year. We also take care of people who pledge a certain amount to the Beis HaMikdash, to the various funds. Maybe they said that their erech, their own personal value, is pledged, or they made one of 2 charamim. There are charamim, meaning they pledged certain things for the use of kahanim or for the use of the Beis HaMikdash, or hekdeshos, they were makdash things. They gave them over to the functional use of the Beis HaMikdash, not for karbanos, but for the value to be used by the Beis HaMikdash. All these things are taken care of now. Also, if there's a woman who was accused of being a sota and she needs to have the special formula prepared for her so that she could drink, to test her to see if she's guilty or not. So we go through the case, we see if she needs to drink the water, and if she does, we take care of that. Any paraduma issues have to be cleared up. If it has to be burned and mixed with the water, we do all of that now. Any egla arufa stories, if there was a corpse found somewhere between 2 villages, we figure out which one is closer, and we do the egla arufa ceremony. Any Eved Ivri who needs a hole punched in his ear, we take care of that now. A mitzora that did not have his tahara process completed is taking care of that now as well. Also, there are wells. Now, these wells were set aside the entire year. They were locked. During the winter, they were locked. The wells collected rainwater, it seeped into the wells, but you couldn't draw water out of it, and the reason is because there was no rain during the summer months, and we wanted these wells to be storing well water so they could be used during the summer, so they were locked all winter. Now, in the 15th of Adar, we opened them up, and we expose them for people to be able to use throughout the summer. We don't close them up again until the end of the summer. Now, there's a different girsa here that says it's not talking about well water, it's talking about the press, a form, but we'll follow this gears here that it's the well water. Alright, now the Gemara has a kasha from Mishnah and Maseches Moed Katan that says that actually 2 of these activities were done later on Chol Hamoed. So the Mishnah says that they would take care of irrigation of fields that didn't get rainwater. They would do that. And they would also mark graves. So they would mark the graves. It says on Chol Hamoed they would mark the graves. So Gemara says, why would they mark the graves on Chol Hamoed? You already said here in this Mishnah that they marked the graves on the 15th of Adar. Why need to mark it again on Chol Hamoed? The Gemara is assuming, when we say Chol Hamoed, we mean Chol Hamoed Sukkos and Chol Hamoed Pesach. Now Chol Hamoed Sukkos, I understand, it could be that the marks got rubbed away already, but Chol Hamoed Pesach, it was just marked less than a month ago. Or maybe exactly a month ago. So the Gemara says it's referring to a situation where there were heavy rains between the 15th of Adar and Pesach, and the rains wash away the limestone markers that they used. They used to pour lime. The lime would survive the summer sun, it would survive to some extent, but the rains could wash it away. So usually it didn't rain during that time too much, but if there were heavy rains, they would have to restore them. Now the next thing that it says there is the Mishnah, that they would go out and they would check for kilayim. They would check for fields that had forbidden mixtures of plants growing together. So Gemara says, but our Mishnah, again, also says they used to do that on the 15th of Adar. Why would they have to do that on Chol Hamoed like the other Mishnah in Moed Katan says? Gemara says, if it was a year where the plants didn't grow until late, or if Yontif came out early, so that the plants weren't really visible yet. What type of plant is what? At the time of the 15th of Adar, they would go out again in Chol Hamoed and they would check that. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the topic of marking the graves altogether. The Gemara says, where do you have a hint about grave marking in the Torah? Now, you don't necessarily have to have a hint. It could be midrabanan that the graves should be marked, or it's logical. You don't want people to step on the graves and be metame the taharis, the hektish things that becomes ruined if they become tame, truma and karbanas and things like that. But the Gemara says, where do you have a hint? So the Gemara brings a long list of names of people, different versions of who it is that said it, but we end up with two sources. One is from the pasuk discussing a mitzvah where it says v'tamei tamei yikra. Now the simple pshat, that means that the mitzvah has to call out and say tamei tamei, I'm tamei, everybody stay away from me. The Gemara says v'tamei, the tamei thing, the source of tumah should be tamei yikra. It should call out a tumah, meaning the tumah itself should advertise itself. It should be marked so that people won't step on it. The tamei should announce that it is tamei by markings. The other source is from a pasuk in Yecheskel, which is talking about Mechamas Gog u'Magog, where there were corpses lying around all over the place. And therefore it says that people would make a mark. Whenever they found a bone or something, they would make a mark so that somebody would come later to bury it. Now this can't be referring literally to marking it so that people didn't become tamei, because the things there aren't necessarily metame. But this is a hint, this pasuk hints at the fact that people would mark tumah spots. So the pasuk says as follows. It says, as people passing through the land, ra etzem adam, if they saw a bone of a person, bana etzlei, they would build near it, tzion, a mark. And the rest of it is and people would, until other people would come to bury it. But over here, these words that the people would pass through and they would see a bone of a person and make a mark, that shows a hint to the concept that we would have to mark the bones so that people wouldn't become tamei. Now, what is the issue that requires marking? So there are three ways that a part of a dead body is metame. The only one that requires marking is something that's metame tumas ohel. Once it's buried, you don't have to worry about tumas maga, about touching the dead. You don't have to worry about moving it because it's not going to be moved. But somebody were to step on it, he would be metame tumas oel. Now, what type of things are metame tumas oel? So, in order to be metame tumas oel, if it's just bones, it has to be at least a quarter of a kav size. It's not enough if it's just a small piece of bone, or it could be small, or it could be the shape where you see the shape, the form of the human form, such as a spine or a skull. Or if you have a certain amount of flesh, if you have concise of flesh, all these things are metame tumas ohel. So now the Gemara says that the words of this pasuk hint to a number of these halachos. First of all, it says etzem. The word etzem indicates that if you have a minimum size of bone, even if there's no flesh on it, if you have a rova hakav, a quarter of a kav of bones, that's metame tumas ohel, and you have to mark it. The next thing it says adam, etzem adam. The fact that it says adam means if you see the form of a person, such as the skull, the spine, you have to mark that too. It's metame tumas ohel. Next it says ubana tzion, they should build a mark. So ubana means that they should build it in so that it's fixed. It should be put on a stone that's attached to the ground. It's not going to roll away. So Gemara says you don't want the stone to roll away, because what happens if the stone rolls away? You end up with a marker somewhere else that there is tumah somewhere else where there is no real tumah. That is a terrible problem. What's the problem? Somebody will step on it, think he's tumah, and he's not, and he'll think that the taharas, the truma, and the karbonas, whatever it is that he's carrying, are tamei. He's going to end up burning them. He'll think that they became tamei, and then you've burned something that you're not supposed to burn. You've destroyed truma and karbonas that don't need to be destroyed. You can't just be machmer and burn things. It's also problematic to burn things that shouldn't be. Now, there's another problem here which the Gemara doesn't mention, that if the marker rolls away, then you're not going to realize when you are stepping on the tumah. The Gemara doesn't discuss that. You could always replace the marker. But if it moves somewhere else, there we have a problem of people thinking that there's tumah where there isn't. Now the next thing that it says here is etzlei. It says that you put the marker near the spot. So the Gemara says this is important. You got to put the marker before the actual tumah. Don't put it on top of the tumah itself, because then people will walk and they'll step on it before they realize that there's tumah there. They'll have already stepped on it. It'll be too late, and they'll already be metame what they're holding. You want to put it in a little bit in advance so that a person steps on the marker and he realizes it. He'll stop and he hasn't stepped on the tumah yet. Now the Gemara says that's why it says etzlai and not olav, that it should be near it and not on top of it. Now the Gemara quotes one more thing here. It says tzion. it says tziyun, you should mark it. So the Gemara says that this teaches, again, that you have to mark all the parts of the body that are metame. Now, the Gemara brings a brisa which discusses some of the details of this halacha. The brisa says that when you mark, so you're not supposed to mark the spot on top of the mace. However, if there is a situation where you do mark the spot directly on top of the mace, then if somebody stands on it, then he becomes tamei right away on the spot. Now, we have a bit of a problem here, and that's if you're going to mark the mace a bit far, so how do you know where the mace is exactly? So generally what you do is that you have to mark a circumference. You have to mark a large area and say that the mace is within this area, the tumah is within this area, and people will know that's what it is, and you just have to move the borders that you're marking a bit further out, so that people on any side that they're approaching it will encounter the markers. On any side that they're approaching, they'll encounter the markers before they get to the tumah itself. Now, says this Mishnah, what happens if you find just a single solitary marker? So you don't know which side the tumah is. So Gemara says it's got to be that the tumah is underneath, because even though you're not supposed to put the marker directly on top of the tumah, that must be what has happened here, because otherwise, how are we supposed to know where the tumah is? A solitary marker, you don't know which side of the tumah the marker is on. It's got to be that the tumah is directly underneath. So if you find a single marker, not marking an area, and not together with other markers that ring a certain area, got to assume the tumah is underneath, and if you step on the marker or the spot where the marker is, you have to assume the tumah is right under that, and you become tamei. However, if you find two markers near each other, then you could assume that if you step on the marker itself, it's not tamei, because you could assume that it was done properly, and it's a bit off the tumah. If you step between the markers, that's where the tumah is. Unless, of course, the area there is plowed. If the area between the markers is plowed, then obviously it's not marking the place between, because nobody plows on top of a grave. So it's got to be that it's two separate markers, each one marking tumah underneath it, and they're not marking the space between them, and therefore if you step on them, you're tamei, and if you step on the plowed space between them, then there is no problem. You could assume that there's nothing there. Says further, the Gemara says in a brisa as well, you're supposed to mark the place where there's flesh. The Gemara says you shouldn't mark flesh. Even though flesh is metame, you shouldn't mark it. What's the problem? The problem is if you're going to mark it, and then the flesh rots away and it disappears. Now you have a marker with no tumah there anymore. Somebody's going to come along and be metame the taharis that he's holding because he stepped on it, but really the tumah is gone. So Gemara says, how is that? So therefore you shouldn't mark it? But in the meantime, people are going to step on it, and they'll be tamei, and they won't realize. So you got to mark it at least now. So Gemara says, no, we would rather have it be unmarked when there is tumah there, just so that it shouldn't remain marked when the tumah is already gone, because we would rather mess up that way. We would rather have something become tamei and not realize it than have for generations and generations that this marker is going to stay here, and people will keep thinking that there's tumah and they'll be metame and burning taharis that they don't need to without any reason. Okay, this takes us to our first Mishnah of the Daf, which goes onto the topic of what the messenger of the basin would do when they found somebody who had kelayim in his field. He had a illegal aser mixture of different types of plants. What did he do with it? The Mishnah spells out, as explained by the Gemara, that there were actually 3 stages in the development of what the Shluchei Bezdin would do when they found kelayim in the fields. First thing they did, the first time, they came and they would pull out those kelayim and they would throw them in a heap in front of the owner of the fields. Now what happened was that the owners of the fields were very happy with this. First of all, their field ended up being weeded. They didn't have to do the work themselves to pull out those kelayim. It was all done for them. Second of all, they had these plants and they were able to feed it to their animals. It was wonderful. So they stopped doing it on their own and they just left it for the Shluchei Bezdin to do. Therefore they changed, and instead of pulling it out and giving it to the owner of the fields, they would just throw it in the street. And that way people would step on it and it would be smashed, and they wouldn't get a chance to feed it to their animals. But the people were still happy because they had the work of the weeding, the pulling out of the kelayim was done for them. So they stopped doing that. Instead what they did was they said the following thing. They said the entire produce of the field is hefker. Until the owners will weed out the kelayim themselves, the produce of the field is completely hefker. It doesn't belong to them. They don't have the right to use it, and it stays hefker. They can't reclaim it. Whoever will weed out the kelayim and remove it, that is the person who will have the right to own the produce of the field. If the owner wants to do it, he could reclaim it as long as he weeds it out. If somebody else comes along and he weeds it out, he could claim all the produce of the field to be his. Now, how did they have a right to do this? So they're using the concept of hefker bezin hefker, is that the court has a right to declare somebody's property, not his. It's a right to declare it ownerless, and anybody could come take it if he wants. So the Gemara is going to ask now, where is the source for that halacha? How do you know that bezin have a right to uproot something? So the Gemara says it comes from the days of Ezra. The bezin of Ezra needed to call a big meeting when they arrived with the entire returning Kehillah from Bavel. A lot of them had non-Jewish wives, and they wanted to get rid of that and a number of other problems that they had. So they called them all together, and they said, anybody who doesn't come, his fields will become hefker. So you see that the Beis Din has a right to be mafkir, to declare ownerless people's fields. Now the Gemara asks, when Beis Din declares somebody's field ownerless, does that make it putter from a meiser? The halacha is as follows. Any field and produce that you have to give part of it to the Levium. The Levium have the right to the meiser, 1/10 of all the produce of the field. Now, a hefker field, the Levium don't get anything from. That's learned out from a psukim explicitly. Levium only get meiser from something which belongs exclusively to the owner and not to the Levium. Something which is hefker and doesn't belong to the owner, as opposed to the Levi doesn't have the din of meiser. But that's if somebody's mafkir himself. Beis Din comes along and they're mafkir a person's field. Do they mafkir to the extent that the Levi also loses because now there's no mitzvah of meiser? Or do they only mafkir the owner's rights to it, but the Levi's rights are not mafkir, and therefore meiser still has to be given from that field? How do we understand what happens by hefker Beis Din hefker? So Gemara wants to bring a raya from Shemitah. The Gemara says that it first quotes a brisa. It explains the brisa at length. Then the Gemara has a proof from the brisa to our question, and the Gemara rejects it and comes up with a different proof. So the brisa says as follows. The brisa says, are you allowed to make a leap year, add an extra month into a year on a Shemitah year? So the brisa says if it's a Shemitah year or even the year following Shemitah, you don't make a leap year. So Gemara explains why not. So if it's a Shemitah year, what's going to end up happening is that you'll have an extra month of Shemitah. You have an extra month of Shemitah, people will not have enough to eat, and they'll work their fields. So you don't want to have more Shemitah than you need to, because you make it difficult for people to be able to work their fields. So the Gemara says that is limited to the time when there was no imports. There was a time when you were not allowed to import vegetables or grain from outside Eretz Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael, and people therefore had limited foods. What was the problem with the imports? The problem was you weren't allowed to bring in a dirt or sand from outside Eretz Yisrael, because there were often bones mixed into them, and you would be metame Eretz Yisrael. If you brought in vegetables and fruits, they came with the dirt that were caught in the roots. So they didn't allow imports. At a certain point, Rabbi saw that imports were needed, and he changed the rules. He was metaken that we're allowing imports. From that time, there was enough food, and therefore you didn't have to worry about not having enough food on a Shemitah year, and they were able to make a leap year even in a Shemitah year. Now, what's the story with the 8th year? So the problem with the 8th year was as follows. They didn't have anything to eat in the 8th year because they couldn't plant until the 7th year. The only thing they could eat was the grain that was stored up from the harvest of the 6th year, that grew in the 6th year. Now, that grain only lasted you so long. At a certain point, they had to use the new grain, which grew in the 8th year. Now, once the 8th year's grain started growing, they were able to use it. The problem was that it was chadash. You're not allowed to use grain that grew in the 8th year until they brought the Karban HaOmer. Karban HaOmer was brought on Pesach. Now, if they would make an extra Adar, that Karban HaOmer would be pushed a month later, which means people had to wait another month to be able to use their produce of the 8th year, their grain from the 8th year. And that was difficult for people, and they were violating the Isser of Chadash. Therefore, they said you shouldn't make a leap year in the year following Shemitah, so that people will not have to wait longer for the Emer, and they'll be able to use the grain that grew in the 8th year. Now, the Gemara again limits this. The Gemara says that's only true during a time when grain grew well, and there was actually grain growing before the Emer was brought. After a while, the produce of Eretz Yisrael dropped in quality, and there wasn't even any grain available in the 8th year. They grew in the 8th year. That was Chadash until after the Karban HaOmer was already brought, even if there was a leap year and it was pushed a month later. So that wasn't a problem, and you ended up being able to bring it in the 8th year. You ended up being able to have the 8th year as a Iber Yar with an extra Adar, pushing the Karban HaOmer later. It made no difference because the grain didn't grow anyway. Now, all this, the Gemara says, proves to us that when Beis Din do something, they can make it hefker even from Levim. How so? Because when Beis Din make a leap year, it ends up that Shemitah ends a month later. Had it not been a leap year, then Tishrei of the next following year would begin a month earlier. Now they made a leap year, you have an extra month. That extra month, the Levim get Meiser? Levim don't get Meiser during Shemitah. So they made that grain that grows in that extra month, the final month of Shemitah, which otherwise would not have been Shemitah, they make it into Shemitah produce, which means that they declare it Hefker, and it's Hefker even from the Levim. They don't get Meiser from that. There's no Meiser on Shemitah produce. So you see that they're able to make Hefker, Beis Din are able to be Mafker things, even taking away the Levi's rights to Meiser. So Gemara says, what kind of proof is this? Beis Din have a mitzvah d'oraisa to make a leap year when they need it. The Torah says, Shmoras Chodesh Aviv, that we are obligated to keep the month of Nisan in the springtime. That it has to be that when the first 15 days of the month of Nisan, when the moon is increasing in size, that should be in the spring. It has to match, and this is something which we need to do in order to keep the solar year and the lunar year aligned. Otherwise, the solar year, which is 11 days longer than the lunar year, will end up mismatched, and the lunar year will cycle throughout the solar year. We don't want that to happen. We want it always to be that Nisan is in the spring. So you have to add leap years. So the Beis Din have a mitzvah d'oraisa to add leap years from time to time. That's not Hefker Beis Din Hefker. That's employing a d'oraisa function. So you have no proof from here that when Beis Din decide on their own to be mafker somebody's things, that they're mafker from the Levi also. So Gemara says, so where then is the proof to this concept, or is there such a proof to the concept? And Gemara says, yes, I'll take it from somewhere else. Now it's halacha in leket. Leket is grain which is dropped when somebody is harvesting his grain. He's bringing it into the house. So when he would cut it off with a sickle, sometimes out of his hand he would drop. He wasn't firmly holding some grains. So if he dropped 1 or 2 grains, he has to leave it for the poor people. Now what happens if the poor people didn't get a chance to pick it up yet, and the guy makes his huge mound of harvested grain in the field on top of the leket? So now the poor people's grain is covered up. They can't get to it. The leket grain is hidden. So Gemara says that the Beis Din made a rule that everything on the bottom layer, any grain which on the bottom layer of this big mountain, this big heap, anything which was lying on the ground, all belongs to the aniyim, belongs to the poor people. It's all considered leket. And the owner doesn't have a right to take any of that. He has to leave the bottom layer there. By doing this, they took away the man's grain and they gave it to the aniyim. Now, the Gemara says this is a machlokes amaroim, how they were allowed to do this. So there's a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, and you make something hefker just for poor people. Is that called hefker to take away the halacha of meiser or not? Again, like we recall, meiser produce doesn't, hefker produce doesn't have an obligation to have meiser taken from it. What if you make something hefker that only the aniyim are allowed to take and not anybody else? Is that called hefker? It's not real hefker. Hefker means that it has no owner. You're not making it having no owner. You're saying it's hefker to the ani. Is that hefker or not? Beis Shammai says yes, Beis Hillel says no. So the Gemara has a machlokes between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yosi when the Beis Din took away this grain and made it leket, this extra grain that they made leket, so they're only making it hefker for the poor people and not for the regular people. So one says this only works according to Beis Shammai, who says that you're allowed to make real hefker only from the poor people and not from the regular people, and that counts as hefker, and that takes away the schus of the Leviim. Just like we know that leket, there is no meiser on leket, and they made that halacha here. So you see that this must be going according to Beis Shammai. The Gemara says that that's what Reish Lakish says. Now Rabbi Yosi says no, even according to Beis Hillel, this is Beis Din in doing it. When Beis Din is doing it, even Beis Hillel agrees that you can make hefker only for aniyim, and it counts as hefker to take away the rights of the Levim to take meiser from it. It's only the whole machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai is only about when somebody is personally being mafker his things. But anyway, what we see from this entire discussion is that the Beis Din took away the grain from its owner. They made it into leket. They gave it to the aniyim. Whether it's Beis Shammai or also Beis Hillel says that they were able to do it, you see that they did do it, and they took it away and they gave it. They made it hefker, and the din of meiser came off. The Levim did not get any part of it. So you see, hefker Beis Din hefker also takes away the rights of the Levim. Now begin the next Mishnah, third Mishnah in the Masechta, and it goes back to the halachas of machatzis shekel and how machatzis shekel was collected and encouraged. So the Mishnah says that beginning on the 15th of the month of Adar, after the messengers had already gone out on the 1st of Adar to remind people to prepare their shekalim, so on the 15th they set up money changers all around Eretz Yisrael, or possibly in Yerushalayim, machlokes rishonim. So they set them up, and that would be another reminder to people, hey, there's money changers around, you better start getting your machatzis shekel ready, and people would come and they would change their prutas, which are smaller coins, in order to get a half shekel coin. Now, on the 25th of Adar, they would withdraw most of the money changers. They would only keep them in a smaller area, either in Yerushalayim or in the Beis HaMikdash itself, depending on how you learn they were set up in the first place. And that would remind people the time is coming, you better give in your machatzis shekel obligation right now. Now, from the 25th as well, the officers of the Beis Hamikdash would start taking mashkonos from people. It means they would go into the houses of people who didn't give yet, and they would confiscate something that they would serve as a collateral, and they would get it back when they brought their machzis shekel. The Gemara elsewhere comments that they were doing them a favor, because if they didn't give the machzis shekel, they wouldn't have the kapara of the karbanos that were purchased with that machzis shekel, so they were doing it for their own good. Now, who is obligated to machzis shekel? So the Mishnah seems to say that Kohanim are not obligated. Leviim, Yisraelim, converts, and freed avodim. These are all have the full-fledged status of Jews that are obligated to machzis shekel, and they would take a mashkin from them. Women and avodim, that's Eved Kanani, did not have an obligation because it's mitzvah cessation is mangroma. It's a time-bound mitzvah, and therefore they didn't take any mashkonos from them. Now, children here means under age 20, no matter what growth of hair they have. Children not obligated in machzis shekel, but if their father gave for them, then it would had the status of a neder, the mitzvah that he accepted, and they were obligated to keep giving. They couldn't stop, but again, they didn't take mashkonos from them. Now, Kohanim, the Mishnah says they didn't take mashkonos from Kohanim. It's not clear exactly whether they were obligated in it or not at that point. And the Gemara, the Mishnah explains it further. Now, in the Mishnayos, this is a separate Mishnah, but here it's put together. And the Mishnah calls it Machlokas in Yavne. Yavne is where the Sanhedrin went after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Machlokas between Ben Bukhri and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, what the status of Kohanim were. Ben Bukhri says Kohanim were not obligated to give machzis shekel, but they were allowed to. Now that's a chiddush, because you would think that if they weren't obligated to give it, then if they would give it, that would mean that they were purchasing part of the public karbanos with their private funds, and it doesn't become public funds because they're not obligated to be part of the fund. And then you have somebody privately owning part of the karbanos that would mess up the carbon, it would be considered chulin in the azara, it would make all kinds of issues. So Ben Bukhari is teaching the Kohanim are allowed to give it. What they're doing is they're giving their money to be part of the public funds. It's not like they're owning a private share in a public carbon. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, no, the Kohanim are obligated to give it. And anybody who doesn't give it is violating an Avera. Now, the Kohanim, however, they claim that they didn't have to give it. And the reason that they claim that is because they said like this. The pasuk says clearly that any carbon mincha, any carbon of flour and oil and foods like that is given from Kohanim, any Kohanim's carbon, mincha is fully burned and not eaten. So the Kohanim said the public funds of the machzis shekel are used to buy 3 types of carbon mincha. They're bought for the carbon omer, they're used for the shtei alechem, the 2 breads and shuas, and they're used for the lechem apanim. So how could those 3 things are all eaten? So if they're purchased with Kohanim's money, you wouldn't be allowed to eat them. Obviously, Kohanim don't give machzis shekel, and that's why you're allowed to eat these things even if they're bought. But the Kohanim are wrong, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, because the halacha that the carbon mincha of a kohen is completely burned only applies to their personal carbon mincha, does not apply to a public carbon mincha that they have a share in. That concludes the Mishnah, and now the Gemara. The Gemara comments on the halacha that the Mishnah had said about Kitanim, and about what it said about Kohanim, and the machlokas which we saw between Ben Berachia and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So first of all, about Ketanim, the Gemara divides it up into 3 groups. The Gemara says, remember, Ketanim here means under age 20. The Gemara says, from Bar Mitzvah until they bring physical signs of growing up, until they bring Shtei Sarais, they do not have to give, we don't even ask them for it. From the time that they bring Shtei Sarais until they turn 20, then we do ask them for it, but we don't take a mashkon. And from when they're older, from age 20, then they're already considered adults, and we will take a mashkon from them in order to make sure that they give the machzis shekel because they are obligated in it. Now, as far as Kohanim, the Mishnah said that we don't take mashkonos from them because of Darkei Shalom. The Gemara says this means kavod. It's not that we're afraid that there'll be a fight. It's that we have to show extra honor for the Kohanim, and therefore we don't take mashkonos from them as opposed to the Yisraelim, that we do take mashkonos from them. Now, we've seen the machlokas as to whether Kohanim are obligated in machzis shekel or not. The Gemara now goes into the source of the machlokas and the arguments between the two. So the Gemara says that Ben Berachia, who had said that they are not obligated, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that they are obligated. So the Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has a source, he has a hint. The Torah, when it describes machzis shekel, says Zeh Yitinu. Zeh is gematria 12. 12 tribes, 12 shvatim should all give machzis shekel. That includes Kohanim. Now the Gemara says it was a kasha asked to Ben Berachia. How could you say that they don't have to give machatzis shekel, but they are allowed to give machatzis shekel. The Gemara says if they don't have to give it, then it comes out that when they do give it, it's really a private purchase that they're making. They are privately owning part of those karbanos with the money that they give, and therefore the carbon mincha that is being purchased with those funds will be Kohanim's private minchas. Now, this was the time that the Kohanim had that they shouldn't have to give altogether. Now, the Gemara is not saying that we're going to go that far and say that the actual carbon mincha that they purchase will automatically be Kohanim's carbon mincha, and therefore you shouldn't be allowed to eat it, just like any carbon mincha of Kohanim you're not allowed to eat. But the Gemara is saying, according to the opinion that they don't have to give it, if they don't have to give it and they do, then the Kohanim, what they had said should prove to be correct. It's not really a public carbon anymore. They really are owning a private chelik of it because they didn't have to give it. So how can somebody hold that they don't have to give it but they are allowed to give it? Then it'll come out that the part that they own is privately theirs, and then it's a private Kohanim's carbon mincha. Kohanim's carbon mincha is forbidden to be eaten, but we know that those funds will be used to buy the lechem apanim, the shtei lechem of shuas, and the carbon omer. You shouldn't be allowed to eat those. So Gemara says that Ben Bracha will respond to that, and he will say, no, when the Kohanim give, they are giving to the public fund, and their money now becomes absorbed in the public fund, and it's bought. It's not Kohanim's money anymore. It's public fund money. Now, the reason why we say that they don't have to give is because we're afraid that if they go ahead and they give, they won't give it wholeheartedly. They'll still be holding on to a portion of it because they'll say, hey, we don't really have to. And then you'll get into problems because it'll be partially theirs. The other opinion of Yochanan ben Zakkai says, no, you tell them that they have to give. And that's it. It's public funds. And then there's no issue of it being a Kohanim's. However, we do agree, even Ben Bracha agrees that if they do give, they actually go ahead and they give, we assume they gave it properly and it's public funds, and therefore it's not considered Kohanim's carbon mincha anymore. Now, the Gemara, when it asked the Kasha, had an interesting step. It said that there's a difference between a Kohen's carbon mincha and Yisrael's carbon mincha. The Gemara had said, just in a similar way that you have that, you also have a difference between a public carbon chatos and a private carbon chatos. That a private carbon chatos, that the owner becomes unable to bring the chatos anymore, either because he passes away or something. The halacha is that the carbon chatos, the animal has to be mesa. You lock it in a room until it starves to death. But a public carbon, you don't have that halacha. If it gets disqualified, you leave it until it gets a moment, and then you sell it and use the money to buy a different carbon. All we're seeing from there is that there's a different halacha to a public carbon and a private carbon, and the Gemara wants to say that also proves there's a difference between a Kohen's carbon mincha and a regular Yid's carbon mincha. The Gemara says that has nothing to do, because this whole opinion of Ben Bracha is set up by Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't even hold it there's a difference as far as chatas is concerned, that they're both mesa, whether it's a public or a private one. But the Gemara brings that as a support, the Gemara rejects it, but it doesn't really affect the Taina either way. Now, the Gemara says there's actually a machlokes how you read some of the psukim of machatzis shekel, and one way supports the opinion that Kohanim have to bring it, and one way supports the opinion that Kohanim do not have to bring it. What do the psukim say? Kol ha'over ala pakudim. Anybody who is over on the pakudim, anybody who passes before the counting, they have to bring the machatzis shekel. So the Gemara says one way of reading that is to say that kol ha'over refers to anybody who is of the age, and anybody who is over. What does over mean? Over means he passed to the Yam Suf. Anybody who went to the Yam Suf has to bring machatzis hashekel. What does pakudim mean? Pakudim means anybody who's counted, whether he's counted in the same way as everybody else or is counted in a different way, it doesn't matter. Anybody who passed through the Yam Suf has to bring it. The other way to read this is kol ha'over al pakudim, anybody who's counted by passing. That only refers to Yisraelim. Yisraelim were counted by passing their machatzis shekel before Moshe Rabbeinu, however, Kohanim, and actually Leviim were counted by Moshe going to them. So therefore they're excluded from this halacha altogether. According to that way of reading it, that would come out like Ben Bracha and Rabbi Yehuda, that they are, Kohanim are excluded from machatzis.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.